Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Today we're continuing book 5, the book on justice, and today we're doing chapter 6, which basically the question of it seems to focus on the doing injustice, right? So let's go look at the continuation. In fact, in many ways, the end of 5 seemed to kind of end a kind of the account of what is just simply, or what we consider what just by nature, right? What is justice simply? What is the concept of what just is, and the perception of just. And there we had aspects of the questions of transactional justice. What is it? And mostly transactional justice was the focus of 5 in that sense, and reciprocity, the concept of reciprocity. Now we're continuing on something, and he says the question of injustice and doing it, right? The doing of justice and injustice, right? Since it is possible that he who does injustice is not yet an unjust person, what sort of wrongs does someone who is in fact unjust commit in the case of each sort of injustice? For example, a thief, adulterer, or a pirate, right? So he gives three. The question is, it is possible that he who does injustice is not unjust. So the chapter ends up with a problem. It's a possibility that those who do injustice are not necessarily unjust people. So, what sort of wrongs does someone who is in fact unjust commit? So, this is a very narrow question. And here, the example in the case of each sort of injustice, for example, a thief, an adulterer, or a pirate, right? The three examples. Or in this respect, will it not make any difference? Right? The question is, or in this, does this does this in this respect make any difference? For someone could have intercourse with a woman knowing who she is, but this has its origin not in one's own choice, but in one's passion. So therefore, that's an interesting question. Uh, 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 Someone who could have intercourse with a woman knowing who she is, but this has its origin not in choice, but in passion. For he who does injustice then is not unjust. For example, he is not a thief, though he stole. He is not an adulterer, though he did commit adultery. And similarly, in the other cases, right? This is 29. Some commentators believe that this opening passage is imported from another section of the text, since it would indeed seem to belong to the subject matter of chapter 8, right? Book 5, chapter 8, and following. But there's no evidence on the manuscript, and that passage is not that on the back itself, the manuscripts, that this is the case. So therefore, a lot of commenters and some translations will now move this away. They want to move it out, move this passage here out. But it's there. In other words, this raises a question. The question of what about the person who is merely the doing of justice mean that you, in other words, the act of injustice or the doing of injustice imply that you are unjust, the character is being fully unjust? Or is it a case, can someone who's not an unjust character nevertheless commit an injustice? And he seems to say yes, it is this. But then he seems to say that he who does injustice then is not unjust in this sense, right? If he's, in other words, if it's done out of, in other words, he seems to suggest that something is done. The intercourse example is, and it's a weird example too, because for someone could have intercourse with a woman knowing who she is, and that by that knowing that she's married, right? But this is done not of choice. Its origin is not of choice, but of passion in that sense. So, well, how does that mean? Okay, it means it's not of choice. In other words, the idea that passion overruled choice, right? That's the example he gives. So let's think about that for a second in a sense, because this is a weird thing he's saying. He's saying that he wants to basically at this moment suggest that, well, we can decide the doing of injustice, just people or people who, okay, it's it doesn't necessarily mean that the doing of an unjust act means necessarily that the person is unjust. Okay, their character is unjust. Okay, there is a gap. It is saying that it is possible that someone who does unjust is not an unjust person. Now, and he ends at that thing, and now he goes, now, but then notice he says, now how reciprocity stands in relation to the just has been stated earlier. So he repeats that he's addressed reciprocity already. But it must not escape our notice that what is being sought is also the just unqualifiedly. That is, the just in the political sense. So therefore, yes, reciprocity in that sense has been addressed, but we must not escape our notice that what is being sought is also the just unqualified. That is, the just in the political sense. Now, note 30, another translation is possible, he says, and that translation is this. But it is not but it must not escape it must not escape our notice that what is being sought is both the just unqualifiedly and the just in the political sense. So therefore there's two possible ways this can be translated. It's unclear that, even though they picked the first case, right, that sense, the first translation that they pick is that it's all the political sense. Or here, the second translation is that there's a distinction between what is just unqualifiedly. I agree with the second translation more than the thing, because I think there is. There is a distinction between what is just unqualifiedly and what is just in the political sense. What is political right, just, and what is natural right. I think this is. But here's the problem. This is the ambiguity of this passage is done purposefully so that both these positions are possible. That political right, in other words, and one possible way is that natural right is political right, and the other one is political right and natural right are distinct from each other. Right? He goes. It is clear. It is unclear. That is whether what is being sought in one or two is one or two things. The singular tatao at the beginning of the sentence suggests, although it does not require, that the singular is intended. Because the beginning of the Greek sentence, the tatao is presented, and that is the singular this, and therefore this suggests it. But in the text, this has happened that a singular this, a tatao, tato, has also been used for multiple things. So therefore, this is. So therefore, this there's an ambiguity here that has to be understood. So let's continue. And this exists also among those who share a life in common, with a view of being self-sufficient, who are free and equal, either in accord with a proportion, sorry, either in accord with proportion, or arithmetically. Okay, so stop. So they are equal either in proportion or arithmetically. Therefore, exists among those who share a life together, common, with a view of being self-sufficient. Okay, that's the nature of the polis, right? That's the polis seeks otakus, right? Um, uh, 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 that either in accord with a proposition or arithmetically. As a result, for all those, for whom this does not exist, there is nothing politically just in relation to one another, but only something just in a certain way and by way of similarity. So wait a minute. So there's not a just. In other words, if you don't have this, you don't have koinonia, you don't have this thing, and you don't have this shared life together, common, and with who are equally and free, right? and either accord with proportion or arithmetically, right? If this does not exist, there's nothing politically just in relation to one another, but only something just in a certain sense. And by way of similarity, not, in other words, there's a similarity to justice. Now, this is interesting. He seems to suggest that true political justice can only occur in the frame. And in fact, this is why I think the translator sees this is only about political justice. I think this is why Collins and Bartlett translate it this way. I'm I'm still kind of disagreeing with them in here, in that sense, because I think what's happening here is that this is about the question of what about those outside of the community? What kind of justice? Now, it's not going to be the same. It's going to be it's going to be just in a certain sense, and there's going to, by way of something similar to political justice, but not the same as political justice. So, yes, the focus on political justice is, yes, there's a frame that political justice has a certain kind of justice, which is law. Remember, political justice manifests itself in law, right? Nomos. But this is not like nomos, right? So it's just in a certain sense and by way of similarity. The just exists for the just exists for those for whom there is also law pertaining to them, and law exists among those for whom there is injustice. So that's okay. This is a weird sentence, and that's also, for just exists for whom there for those for whom there is also law pertaining to them, and law exists among those from whom there is injustice. So, okay, that's a weird phrase. That's a, So therefore, this is clearly referring to the nature. The question is, the just exists for those. I want to question this. Let's look at another translation for a second. This is always a pain. Hold on. I don't mean to be a bum bum, but it says here in this translation, this is not an Australian one. This is Brodie and Rao, Christopher Rao. So it's Oxford, complete Anglo-Brit, right? Anglo, mostly the Brit school, right? Hold on. He goes, hence, those who do not meet the conditions, there is no such thing as what is just in this political sense in relation to each other, only what is just in a way and in virtue of a certain resemblance. For there is justice between people who also have the law governing interactions between them, and people have the law if there can be injustice between them, since legal judgments distinguishes between what is just and unjust. So here, I am more going to agree with Brodie here, because this is this is the Greek. Yes, the Greek says this. Collins and Bartlett are giving you exact thing of Greek, but it's confusing. The Greek in itself is kind of perplexing. What he's trying to say here is that the logic, what Brodie does is this. There is a logic here. So therefore, as the result of this, those who does not exist outside of political community, right? There is nothing politically just in relation to another, but there's something that is of a certain way. There nevertheless is a kind of justice, but it's not like political. It differs from political justice. but it has kind of, it does the same thing. It says something similar about it. The just exists for those, because the just exists for those people outside of political society as well. For just exists for those for whom there is also law. So that what he's saying here is that this is about political community here, right? And law exists among for those. It's to address the question of injustice, right? I think that's, again, this one little sentence here highlights political justice about the purpose of law. That law plays a role to achieve justice in a certain way, to help bring just, and to address the questions of injustice, right? For justice is a judgment about the just and the unjust. So this is that line. Because 31, the term here for justice is dike, right? This is the question, dike, and for judgments, krisis. In other words, that it's a decision. We have translated it elsewhere as decision, and at the beginning of 4.1 as a legal adjudication. So, crisis, for judgment is a crisis. Now, this is a decision. A decision must be made. A crisis is a thing that hits to a point where you have to either or something. A decision must be made. And therefore, what Aristotle is saying here is that for justice is a crisis, a decision about the just and the unjust. Among those for whom there is injustice, there is also also the doing of injustice among them. Though among those for whom there is doing injustice, okay, this is that weird line. So, but though among those for whom there is the doing of injustice, not all are marked by injustice. Right, that line. This is that paraphrase. So, this thing is, let's stop here. This is a separate thought. This is a clause. So this is reminding us that though among those for whom there is doing just, not all of them are going to be marked by being unjust, right? So he says that there is a doing of injustice among them, and this is to distribute more of the unqualifiedly good things to oneself and less of the unqualifiedly bad than one ought. So therefore, this is this way. And what is this injustice? This injustice is to distribute more of the unqualified good things to oneself and less of the unqualified bad things. Hence, we do not permit a human being to rule, but rather law, because a human being makes this distribution of good, of things good and bad for himself, and so becomes becomes a tyrant. Now, 32 here is a very interesting. Given the context, we accept the reading of the manuscript, one manuscript, nomos, rather than logos. Okay, this is why he's going to read it with the manuscript rather by law rather than reason. Reason makes sense too, right? But rather reason. In other words, we do not permit the humans to rule, the will. In other words, there's two ways to read this. One manuscript would put it as translated as nomos and therefore law, and this is how he's translating it, because they would do it by law. But there's another understanding here, is that it's not nomos but logos. And if you read logos, it's you not permit human beings to rule by their desires, by their passions or their desires, but by reason, because a human being makes this distribution of good and things and bad merely by his desires, right, for himself, he will become a tyrant. That makes as much sense, because a tyrant is the person who lives. The tyrant, in this sense, is the one who does not live by reason, but lives by doing whatever he wants, doing whatever he desires. Right? That's the whole point about tyranny. It is the unrestrained doing of desire, and that's the thing. So I think here I would suggest that maybe the choice for law here is kind of not necessarily correct. That logos may be working better here if we understand that the question here is about desire, right? Not human beings simply, but nature of human beings, but human beings to rule in the sense that they rule by their will. They're ruled by not will, but desire and wants, okay, rather than reason. But a ruler is a guardian. Now, this is the problem. I think why he chooses. They choose law, because there's a ruler. This is a guardian of the just. So therefore, it goes to a political question, and we've been within the frame of a political issue, right? But also the border of it. This is the question. This is why this is a borderline. This is the case where in this chapter there is this transition from the political just to the just outside of political community, right? And therefore the question of human being is also at stake here. So that's why I think the logos makes, in a sense, more sense, right? But let's continue here. But a ruler is a guardian of the just, and if of the just, then also of the equal. So therefore, again, the guardian is also both a guardian of the just, and because if he's the guardian of the just, then he's also the guardian of the equal. For it seems that he gains nothing for himself if he is indeed just. In other words, he's not aiming at, if he's just, he's not going to benefit himself at the expense of others in that sense, right? He does not distribute more of what is unqualifiedly good to himself, unless it is proportional in relation to himself. So this idea, unless it's proportional in relation to himself. Hence, he labors for another. And on account of this, people declare that justice is good for, in other words, hence he labors for another, and on account of this, people declare that justice is the good for another, as he said also before, right? In other words, that so some wage must be given, therefore some wage, therefore must be given to him, and this is honor and privilege. So therefore, the wage of the judge is honor and privilege. So it's proportional. He should get proportion to what he is. So not necessarily good things and wealth, but honor and privilege. For but those for whom these sorts of things are not sufficient. This is the problem here. In other words, if honor and privilege is not sufficient, and these are not sufficient, they will become tyrants, because they'll do what? They'll do tyrants because they will give instead of taking the pay, they'll basically distribute the good things and bad things unequitably, right? The just particular to a slave master and to the father are not the same as these political justice, though they're similar. Now, this is interesting. The just pertaining to a despotic, a slave master, master of slaves, and to a father. Again, the question is, this is some may not read this saying, "Oh, but then slave master and father are equal." No, all these three things they're not the same as each other, as the sense a political sense of justice. So therefore, the just pertaining to the slave master and to the father are not the same as these. That is political justice in that sense, right? Though they're similar. For there is no injustice in an unqualified sense towards one's own things, but one's property or offspring, until the latter is a certain age and independent, is like a part of oneself, and nobody chooses to harm himself. So this is interesting, property. Therefore, the question is, there's a logic here that the property is the children, and the slave is kind of like he's going to be saying, okay, there's no injustice in an unqualified sense towards one's own things, but one's property or offspring, until a certain age is independent, right, is like a part of oneself, and no one chooses to harm it in that sense, right? So therefore, that the slave is not, the master is not going to harm the slave because he's his property. The argument goes here. It doesn't make sense, and there's no, and that's why this Whereas the opposite for strangers and other people, there is a possibility of harming it, right? Hence, there is no injustice in relation to oneself, nor therefore is there what is unjust in just in the political sense. Okay, so therefore there is not even there's no when you talk about oneself, there is no political sense of what is unjust and just, the just and unjust in in the political sense, in the sense of what is lawful and unlawful in that sense. So and the bringing up of the slave master and the parent is that there is justice in there, right? There is, but they're not the same as this kind of justice, and that is because there for them there is that this the slave is their property, and the child is of themselves, and at least to a certain age, that they belong to them, and you don't harm yourself. That's what belongs to you is tied up to yourself, right? And no one and is part like a part of oneself. He says, the latter is and is like a part of oneself, and no one chooses to harm himself. Hence, there is no injustice in relation to oneself, or nor therefore is there what is unjust and just in the political sense, right? There's no harm. Thus, there's no injustice in relation to oneself, and therefore, nor therefore is there what is just, unjust, and just in the political sense. For as we saw, these accord with law and exist among those for whom law is natural, namely those for whom there is equality in ruling and being ruled. This is this idea that you are citizens. You are citizens. That law, in other words, namely for those there is equality in ruling and being ruled. This is remember this idea of that there's people are ruler and rule, being ruled and ruling in turn. This is citizens. These are free citizens, and therefore this is political rule in that sense. That's why this is what's political in that sense. For and law is tied. It records with law and exists among those for whom law is natural, that is, citizens in that sense. Hence, the just exists more in relation. In other words, this is even more interesting. The just exists more in relation to a wife than in one's relations to one's offsprings and the possession. For this is the just pertaining to a household management. So therefore, the just is the husband and wife. This is an interesting problem. There's more, hence, the just exists more in relation to a wife than to the question of one's offsprings and possessions, because one's offsprings and possessions are part of you. They are parts of yourself. Okay, and you can't harm yourself, but your wife is not you in this sense, and therefore she's the other in that sense. She is not you, and therefore there is this sense of can be harm towards them or do injustice to them, right? Uh, 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 and this is what pertains to household management in sense the concerning of the offspring, and so the household there's no, and this is the thing interesting that what is pertains to house management, the concern for offspring, the relations between husband and wife, children, parents, children, and master slaves. Right, that book one of the politics. Go back to book one of the politics. But this is a very difficult thing to understand because this is what pertained to household management, not political rule in that sense. But there's something about the husband and wife that there is a kind of something. In fact, in the politics, you'll say there's something political about the husband and wife relationship that echoes the political in that sense. But this too is different from the just in the political too, right? That, in other words, all these things that he talked about here, the husband and wife, but this is too is different from the just in the political sense. So the household management, all these things that you talk about household, but this is different from the justice in the political sense. So he's going about the question of what is kind of askew from the political sense. Okay, this has been a difficult chapter. I can see why people might be confused. Um, and why this is many translations, in fact, don't really translate the text, but will instead give kind of glosses over it. So we'll stop here. If you have any questions or concerns, please put them below, and I will respond to them when I see them. If you like today's chapter, please like it. Please like it. Hit the like button. Share it on social media and share it about with friends. If you aren't subscribed or have not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to come join, see the channel, and and get them to subscribe. That would help grow the channel. Now, if you didn't like what I did, or you disagree with something, you can always thumb down, but say why in the comments so people can learn. You can follow me on social media. The social media links are below. If you want to know more about me as a researcher and as a scholar and see my scholarship and check things out like that, the academic social media links are below, following the social media links. If you want to help me to do what I do, contribute to this, this financially, you can do so through the links to Patreon and Subscribestar listed below. Or you can buy one of my books. Other way you can help me is to buy one of the books listed below. You can buy it at your bookstore, or have your bookstore order a copy, or order it through a online bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever. If those of you who are going to really study politics and would like a guide, check out my notebook for Aristotle's Politics, published by Lulu, and order it by Lulu. If you order it by Lulu, I'll get the profit that the bookstore gets. So if you order directly by Lulu, that's it. Well, I hope everyone's okay. We'll see you next time in Chapter 7 when we look at Chapter 7. And we'll go on to again on the question of the political sense of justice, right? Take care. Bye-bye.